oftentimes I'm asked, okay, so in your house, are you using the power that is coming off these systems? And maybe we should just speak to that question here about where that power gets used and how that works in the metering side of things.
On the feed-in tariff program, the way the Green Energy Act was designed, it was really selling power back to the grid. And this is called a parallel connection. So parallel connection means that the power that comes off goes through the meter and goes into your house. That's the consumption side. If you put your solar project in there, it's producing power, goes into this meter, and then goes technically back out to the pole. But really it goes across to the next meter, then goes into your house. But it's being metered with what you produce first, and then it goes back into your house. So it may be your own power, because hydro is a lot like water. If you think of as being a plumber, it takes the path of least resistance. So the least resistance is to go right back into your house. So it's being produced, goes right back into your house if you're using it. If you're not using, if you've got nothing on in the house, everyone's away at work, it's a nice bright sunny day, it'll go back out on the grid, go to the next home. That's the least path of resistance.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of how those meters work and how the billing and what have you works, you're selling that power back to the grid. It's all going out through a meter. It's all going back to the grid at whatever the contract price is.
That's correct.
And then you have a separate meter that is your household usage, which is what you're paying for.
Yes.
Which brings up the whole question then about the difference between those values and how that can make sense. Because in most places in Ontario, hydro electricity is being billed at around 13 cents, 12 to 13 cents per kilowatt hour, depending on the contract you might have with a retailer or those kind of variabilities, the distribution charges, the taxes. When at the end of the day, it's in around 12 to 14 cents.
That's correct.
And depending on the contract that you have, the MicroFIT contract, right now, we should talk about rates in a minute here, but rates have been 80 cents initially when the program came out. Then they were around 64 cents, and now it's a little bit less than that. But there's a pretty big difference between 13 and, let's say, 64 cents.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that obviously people are wondering about. How is it that we can afford to pay people that install renewable energy projects that kind of a premium? And I think it starts with having to back up and understand how is energy sold in the province of Ontario. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that hydroelectric, primarily Niagara Falls, nuclear energy, Bruce, Darlington, Pickering, you start looking at these different facilities, and if you do a little bit of research, you'll start to discover the cost of putting up some of these installations. One of the things that we look at in the solar side is the government spends a huge amount of money. So think building a nuclear plant. If you spend $25 billion to build a nuclear plant, then the government also pays for a corridor of hydro lines from that plant. And then they go into debt, and they then charge everybody something called debt retirement fee, things like that. But they've got this corridor built, and one of the things that's a little bit confusing is when you start looking at the price of hydro, is some things are included, some things aren't. The corridor is paid for by the government. It's not paid for by the nuclear plant, okay? There's no corridor required with solar, okay? Disposal of toxic waste is paid for by the government, not part of the nuclear expense. So when you really add all these things up into the cost of nuclear, it's a lot more expensive than what you might think. And nuclear gets paid more than what you pay as a consumer. Probably double it or triple it, and that's typically what their payments are. And so when you really add it up, nuclear is quite an expensive source of power. 57% of Ontario's power comes from nuclear. And so what people don't recognize, and I didn't realize this either, but when you start looking at if Niagara Falls is, say, getting 23 cents a kilowatt hour, or Darlington's getting 43 cents a kilowatt hour, or Bruce is 16.8 cents a kilowatt hour, they're getting paid different rates depending on how new their facilities are, money that's got to be invested based on their efficiency and everything else. So there's a complicated model. The average consumer doesn't know this. All they know is that I pay 6.7 cents at my low use time and 11.9 cents at my high peak time, and the blended rate comes up to like 9.9, and then I pay a line loss charge, I pay a debt retirement fee. So when you add all these fees up, you're right, 13, 14, 15 cents per kilowatt hour, that's sort of what our costs turn out to be. So the average consumer, what they need to know is Hydro One has made it clear that they're going to be increasing the rate by 3.5% per year, probably for the next 20 years. So we're going to end up paying closer to what would be a real cost of power in this province.
And your point is, in there, is that we don't pay the cost of what it costs to generate electricity. We don't pay the actual cost of electricity.
The bottom line is, if consumers understood that we can actually be part of producing our own power, and we're not having to add any expansion in grid infrastructure, we can just plug into what's already here, and the actual property owner puts the money up instead of the government putting the money up. But that's a good thing for the province overall. And that will drive down, with solar panels dropping in price, that will stabilize our cost of electricity production. The other thing that's kind of interesting is there's been a paradigm whereby every 20 years there's always a renewed contract with the government of Ontario. And with solar, these solar panels will last somewhere between, I'm going to say 25 to 35 years is probably expected life. In fact, most of them have 25-year warranties. And so if you get 35 years out of your solar panels and you only paid for them 35 years earlier, it's called the levelized cost of electricity. And so your actual cost, if you get an extra 15 years, instead of just a 20-year contract like what Niagara Falls will get before they need to do some upgrades, or before a nuclear plant needs to be renovated and have some improvements and rejuvenation, this is where solar makes a lot of sense, because your levelized cost of electricity drops dramatically if you could spread it over 35 years, which is the actual life of solar.
Right. Now, my understanding has always been that in Ontario, electricity has always been a subsidized commodity, that we have never paid, right from the time of Niagara Falls and the start of electrical in Ontario, that the actual rate of what you pay has never matched what it costs to generate the electricity, and that difference has been made up either through taxes or some kind of debt retirement charge, but oftentimes in the past through taxes, and so we're finally coming to a place now where, I know we're both hearing it, people talking about solar and concern that it's going to rise their electricity rates, and unfortunately part of the message there is that we're going to end up just paying closer to what it actually costs. And we've been sheltered from that for an awful long time.
I think I want to address that concern that solar will be increasing the price that what people pay. I agree with what you said, Tom, is that we have been sheltered. We don't know what the actual cost is, most of us as an average consumer. And so I think what people need to recognize is that right now solar produces about 1% of Ontario's total energy. And so if you think about it, even if it was paid at 80.2 cents, the amount of incentive that's paid to solar compared to the ocean of incentive that's paid to nuclear, it really is a drop in the bucket. And the average person, until you get that in perspective of how much is really being paid in subsidies to different parts of the industry, you don't have a real appreciation. And solar is such a small, like 1% of our total usage is in renewables right now.